Welcome to Quilt Addicts Anonymous. I'm Stephanie Sebbing, and today I'm going to teach you how to make block 5 in the Dimensions Block of the Month quilt. This is our 2018 block of the month, and I'm really excited that you're following along with us. So last month we made the setting triangles that set the scene for doing the corners of the quilt, and now we get started on the rest of the blocks that make it up. So we're doing full blocks, not setting triangles this time, and we have this really gorgeous teal Kinkame shades. So we have two different size rectangles that we're using in this month's block of the month. So make sure you refer to your pattern book to make sure you cut those the right way from your strips so you can get that nice gradated look. We're getting all this color change from one with the fabric. They're really awesome. I just love these Kinkame shades by Clothworks and the way that they're turning out in this quilt. So we've got one that we're going to use for stitch and flip flying geese, and one that we're going to cut into triangles for our quarter square triangles that will be part of this block. So let's get started. So just like the first time we sewed stitch and flip flying geese, I've already pre-drawn a line from point to point on the wrong side of all of my squares. You're going to want to make sure you do that first. And then I'm going to line this up so that the edges of my little square are even with the edges of my large rectangle. Now I want to make sure that I set my sewing machine so that my needle is in the center position. That's going to allow me to sew just one needle width to the right of that line that we drew, so we've got plenty of room to flip that fabric over and still have our rectangle be the correct size when we're done. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and grab this piece, do a few little final adjustments to get everything nice and lined up. And now I'm going to start stitching. So I've sewn the flying geese wing onto the right side of all of my rectangles, and now I have to cut that 1/4 inch seam off. To do that, I've got my 1/4 inch line that I just line up right on top of the seam line that I just sewed. And I just slice off that corner. And I'm going to give these a press. Usually set my seam. And then press your wing open. Now we're going to do the same thing, but we're going to sew this little square onto the other side of the flying geese. Now we need to sew the flying geese together to make the quadrants of our block, and I'm going to show you how to get a perfect point on your flying geese every time. So one of the biggest challenges people face when sewing these together is making sure that this point doesn't get clipped off when they're sewing their flying geese together. When you flip this block over, you can see it really clearly on this fabric with this white thread. Your thread makes a nice X here. So when you're sewing, you want to make sure that your needle is one needle width to the right of where these threads come together and make an X. And if you hit this point every single time with your needle, then you are never going to lose a point on your flying geese ever again. So if you're sewing along and you're stitching here, or even right on top of this thread line, that's when you lose your point because the fabric needs a little bit of space as it flips over when you press it. So what you want to do is, if you've done everything right, you'll be able to just sew a 1/4 inch seam and you're good to go. But if for some reason this is not a true 1/4 inch from the edge of your fabric, what you're going to do is you're going to be sewing your 1/4 inch seam, and then you're going to just jog in a little bit until you hit this point, and then if you need to come back out to get your 1/4 inch seam, then do that. It's going to be far less noticeable if you have a little wobble here than if you cut off that point. So what you want to do is just make sure that you are stitching right where that line is, just to the right of this X. So I'm going to take this, I'm going to flip it over, and then I want to flip it over again because I want to sew this seam. I want to sew where we made that mark to get that perfect point. So I need to change the stitch setting on my machine so that I'm now sewing a 1/4 inch stitch, because that's what we need to put our pieces together when we quilt. All right, if you want, you can pin these. I generally avoid it if I can, so I try not to, and I just line my edges up. But that is completely personal preference. So once I get a few stitches in, I will sort of realign, get my points together on the other end, and then I just real slowly approach that point. So I make sure that my needle is 1 needle width to the right of that X, and then sew the rest of the way. So here's our moment of truth. I'm gonna press that. Oh, and that is looking good. You've got your point coming almost all the way to the tip, and that's a perfect join. That is a really great join, and I'm very happy with this. But that's the trick, is making sure that when you sew this, that your stitching is just 1 needle width to the right of where that X comes together. You can even get a little closer than what I've got here, but definitely err on the side of caution when you're doing that. All right, we've completed our flying geese units and set those aside for later. Now it's time to cut our 1/4 square triangle units. Now, in order to have the color changing from bottom to top on these triangles, we had to first cut them into rectangles, and now we're going to cut off the corners to create our 1/4 square triangle. So to do that, I'm lining up the 45-degree line with the bottom, or the darkest part of the rectangle. And then I'm going to slice that corner off. Now I'm going to turn it to the side, and now this is still the darkest part of the rectangle, just now it's on my left. And so I'm lining up that 45-degree line with that edge, and then the point is right at the point of that rectangle, and then I'm just going to slice off this top. Now I'm going to repeat that process with my others to finish up this block. As long as I'm already cutting, I'm going to go ahead and slice this square in half as well. I want to cut from corner to corner so that I can have the other half of my triangle unit that we're going to make here. So we're going to arrange these real similarly to what we did in our previous block, with the color changes pointing in, so that color is gradually changing as you point towards that center of that block. Triangles can be a little tricky, especially since we're sewing on the bias. The bias is the angle of the fabric, so it's not on the straight of grain or the width of grain, it is on this part, and it's just a little bit stretchy. So we want to make sure that we're aware of that when we're sewing. You don't want to pull or tug or force it through your feed dogs. And then the other thing I do is I set my sewing machine to sew a scant 1/4 inch stitch. All that means is right now I have my needle width in the position to sew a 1/4 inch stitch. I'm going to press a button so that it moves 1 needle width to the right, and then I have just a teeny little smaller stitch, and that helps so that way we have a little bit to trim down, and make sure our blocks are going to be the right size when we're all finished. All right, so I'm just going to lay these guys right sides together, and we're going to put them through the sewing machine. Now I'm going to press these open. I always like to press seams like this open instead of to one side or the other, because I find that my final block lays a whole lot flatter when I'm done. Now it's time to sew these two halves together to create our kind of pinwheel-like look that goes with this. We've got our quarter square triangles and we have a half square triangle. Now it's important to note that when I flip this over, the piece triangle is going to be just a smidge smaller than the solid square triangle. I did that on purpose so that we have a little bit extra to trim off so we can make sure that we have triangles units that are the correct size when we're all done. All right, so I've got this lined up and I'm still using that scant 1/4 inch seam to sew. Again, giving myself that little bit of extra wiggle room to make sure that everything is the way it should be in the end. Just like that little seam, I'm going to press this one open as well. To do that, I put the tip of the iron right on top of that seam line. And when you press it, you should have a nice flat seam here. If you have any wiggles or wobbles, then that means that there is a pleat on the other side. So you're going to make sure you fix that so you have a nice flat block. Now it's time to trim these babies down. Now these triangles were made at the exact size where we shouldn't have to do too much trimming except for to get these dog ears off. We should have a little bit more trimming to do on the gray side. So here's how you do this. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put it so my 45-degree line is going right through this seam allowance between my two 1/4 square triangles. I'm also making sure that the 4.5 inch mark of my ruler is coming right out at the seam line between my two halves at the top and at the bottom over here. If it's not quite where you want it to be, you can always give a dog ear a little tug with your fingernails to kind of make it get where you want it to go. Then I'm just going to trim off the sides. Again, I didn't really have too much to trim off from the green, just a little slivers of fabric where it stretched a little on the bias, and then those dog ears. We'll have a little bit more to trim off on this side. So now I've still got that 45-degree line going in that middle seam, except of course it doesn't go all the way across because this is a solid piece of triangle fabric there. So again, I still have my 4.5 inches at the top and bottom of this seam, and I have my 4.5 dotted line even with the edge that we just trimmed solid there. Give that a little trim. Now we have a perfect pinwheel unit where our points go straight out to the edges in all sides here, and this is going to be great for a really flat, really perfectly sized block. I'm going to do that on the other one. We're ready to go. All right, we've got all our units together. Now it's time to put this baby together into a final block. So just like these, we want to make sure that we are sewing just the right side of our thread X when we put these guys together. You don't really need to do any pinning because there aren't any seams at the top or the bottom here. You just need to make sure that your edges line up and that your seam is right to the right of that thread X. I'm also going to make sure I set my sewing machine back to that regular 1/4 inch stitch. We don't need the scant 1/4 inch seam any longer. We have to do the same thing on this side. What I like to do is when I flip this together, I also like to flip it over so that way I'm sewing with these on the top. I'm also going to do a little bit of pinning here because I want to make sure that these come together. So what I do is I kind of look at it from the top and I line it up so that my seams are right on top of each other. And then I'm going to stick a pin in the right side just to hold that together long enough to get it to the sewing machine. So I'm going to slide that under the sewing machine needle. I'm going to take a couple of stitches forward to get that secured so that way those points stay where I want them. And then I can remove my pin, line up my corners, and stitch the rest of the way down. As long as you stick with a 1/4 inch seam, you shouldn't have to worry too much about cutting off the edges of those flying piece points. So when it comes to pressing, you always want to press against the path of least resistance. So for this one, these seams are going to go a lot easier underneath here because there are fewer seams to deal with. So this seam then, I want to make sure that I press underneath going the other direction. So that way my seams can butt up nicely against each other for a really great join for this last row here. So now we just need to flip these guys right sides together. Those seams are going to lock in place because they're pressed in the opposite direction. Put a pin in there. And then on this side, we got the same deal where we have triangles coming together. So I'm just going to lay those seams, take a look from above, make sure that my seams are laying right on top of each other. Press that down, hold it in place, and put a little pin in there. Just going to sew this together and we're good to go. So there is more dark on this side than on this one because we have a full half that's on a triangle there. So I'm going to press underneath this side of the block just so that seam is hidden a little bit there. We don't have too much shadowing. Just like all of our other blocks, I'm going to give this a little spritz with a little Mary Ellen's Best Press. That'll help it lay nice and flat without leaving any residue on our fabrics. Well, this is it. This is block 5 of our Dimensions Block of the Month quilt by Quilt Addicts Anonymous. I just love, love, love these fabrics. I know I've said it every single time, but it's because these Kinkame shades are just great. Who would have thought that you can get all this color variation from one strip of fabric? It's so beautiful. Love it. Well, I hope you're enjoying the Dimensions Block of the Month quilt so far. If you are just watching these videos and you're falling in love with the pattern and the fabrics, you can make sure you can go get it at shop.quiltaddictsanonymous.com, or you may be able to get it at your local quilt shop as well. If you like this video, make sure to subscribe so you can get all of our quilting tips and tricks when we post them to YouTube. You don't want to miss any one of them. We've got tons of them that you can watch, and we're going to be posting a whole lot more. Thanks so much for following along, and until next month, happy quilting!